Wraith by William Toney. Chapter 33, Crossroads. The Aftermath. Aaron sat on the edge of his apartment's couch, his hands clasped tightly together. The dim afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting a muted glow across the room. Lilah stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. "They're calling him the Dark Wraith," Lilah said, her voice tinged with unease. "The news is already spinning the story about Jason." Aaron didn't respond immediately. His mind replayed the chaotic events of the previous night. Jason's illusions, the bloodied civilians, and the pendant's destruction. The weight of it all pressed against his chest like a vice. "He's in custody," Aaron said finally. "At least he can't hurt anyone else." Lilah turned to face him, her arms crossed. "But what about the rest? What about Wright? What about everything else that's happened?" Aaron's jaw tightened. "I don't know, Lilah. I'm trying to figure it out." Before she could press him further, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Aaron rose cautiously, his senses on edge. Through the peephole, he saw Detective Marlowe standing outside, his expression weary but determined. Marlowe's update. Aaron opened the door, stepping aside to let Marlowe in. The detective entered, his sharp eyes scanning the apartment as if cataloging every detail. Lilah offered a small, hesitant smile, but Marlowe's demeanor remained serious. "Rough night?" Marlowe asked, his tone dry. "You could say that," Aaron replied, his voice guarded. "What brings you here?" Marlowe sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Wright's in critical condition. Doctors don't think he's going to make it. If he doesn't, this city's going to spiral even further into chaos." Lilah's brow furrowed. "And Jason?" "He's in custody," Marlowe said, turning to her. "No bond. They're pinning every unsolved murder in the past few months on him. Whether he did them or not doesn't matter at this point. The city wants someone to blame." Aaron's fist clenched. "Jason's dangerous. You can't underestimate him." Marlowe nodded. "I'm not, but there's something else I need to say." He looked directly at Aaron, his gaze piercing. "I don't know what you're mixed up in, but I know you're not the bad guy here. You've done things I can't explain, but I'm not going to mention the supernatural in my reports. No one would believe me anyway." Aaron's shoulders relaxed slightly, but Marlowe continued. "That said, you need to leave. Take Lilah and get out of the city. Whatever's coming next, it's not going to be pretty, and you don't want to be in the middle of it." Lilah reached for Aaron's hand, her voice soft but urgent. "He's right, Aaron. We could go somewhere safe. Start over." Aaron glanced at her, then back at Marlowe. "I appreciate the advice, Detective, but I'm not sure running is the answer." Marlowe sighed heavily, his expression grim. "Just think about it." The Infernal Gathering. In a desolate realm, a massive, blackened castle loomed over a fiery landscape. Inside a grand room of the castle, a gathering was taking place. The room was a vast, shadowy expanse, its walls adorned with carvings that seemed to twist and shift in the dim, otherworldly light. A long, ornate table stretched through the center, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. 13 chairs stood around it, each uniquely adorned to reflect its occupant's identity, though only 5 were filled. Each chair reflected the essence of its occupant. One chair sagged as if exhausted. This one belonged to a being named Nereus. The next one was gilded and regal. It was occupied by Dominies. Gorvan's chair oozed with grotesque opulence. Lirith's chair shimmered with a sickly green light, and Valara's was draped in luxurious crimson. Eris materialized near the doorway, her golden gown tattered and faintly translucent, her presence diminished but still commanding. She strode forward, her steps deliberate despite the tremble in her form. The room's occupants turned their attention to her, their gazes varying between amusement, curiosity, and disdain. At the head of the table sat Dominies, his posture regal, one hand resting lightly on the arm of his intricately carved chair. His pale, angular face bore an expression of perpetual confidence, as though every word he spoke would be law. The shimmering emblem of a crowned lion was etched into the back of his chair, an unsubtle display of dominance. his piercing eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed on Eris as she approached. "Back so soon, Eris?" Dominus's tone was smooth, mocking, as though her return was an inevitability he had long anticipated. "I assume you've brought news of your triumph?" Eris halted in the center of the room, her golden eyes blazing with anger. "Triumph? Hardly. Allistor has been freed, and Lilah with him. To make matters worse, they both have acquired very capable avatars." A murmur rippled through the room. Lilah, seated to Dominus's right, leaned forward slightly, her emerald green eyes glinting with interest. She traced a finger idly along the table's edge, the motion languid yet precise. Her dark curling hair framed a face that seemed sculpted for allure, though her beauty was tinged with a subtle sharpness, as if she were a blade concealed in silk. "Allistor?" Lilah repeated, her voice smooth and silken. "And Lilah as well? My, Eris, you've been quite busy. Perhaps too busy." Her lips curved into a smile, but it was far from kind. "Tell me, how exactly did this happen?" Eris's jaw tightened. "It was a calculated risk," she admitted through gritted teeth, "one that your constant needling certainly didn't help." Lilith's smile widened. "Oh, darling, don't blame me for your missteps. If anything, I'd say you've given us all something very interesting to discuss." At the opposite end of the table, Gorvin let out a low chuckle. His imposing figure seemed almost too large for his chair, his heavy, muscular frame giving him the air of a man who had never denied himself anything. His sharp teeth gleamed as he grinned, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the table. The faint scent of something rich and intoxicating seemed to cling to him, though no source was visible. "Allistor," Gorvin rumbled, his voice deep and resonant. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in some time. I wonder if he's changed. Do you think he still remembers what we did to him?" His grin widened, and he licked his lips as though savoring the thought. "I've tasted many delectable things, but the look of betrayal on his face was utterly delicious." Seated 2 chairs away from Gorvin was Nereus, who shifted slightly in his seat, his expression one of mild annoyance. He rested his chin on his hand, his eyes half-lidded, as if the entire conversation were an unwelcome interruption to his day. His pale blue robes shimmered faintly in the dim light, and his long, unkempt hair fell around his shoulders in lazy waves. "Allistor's freedom is a problem for those who care to make it one," Nereus muttered, his voice low and unhurried. "I warned you not to invoke his wrath, and you did it anyways. But I fail to see why I should concern myself with it. He has his little avatar. Let him play his games in the human realm." Dominus's gaze shifted to Nereus, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Always so dispassionate, Nereus. But perhaps you're right. What could Allistor do to us now? He's a shadow of what he once was." "I wouldn't dismiss him so easily," Eris snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room's languid atmosphere. "He may be diminished, but Lilah is another matter. She's already found her avatar, and she was the one to send me back." That caught their attention. Lilith's eyes gleamed with new interest, and Gorvin leaned forward, his grin fading into a more serious expression. "A female avatar, is it?" Lilith mused, her voice soft. She tapped her lips thoughtfully before her smile returned, wicked and calculating. "Perhaps I should find myself an avatar as well. Someone strong, someone interesting. Maybe even hers or Allistor's." She laughed softly, the sound both alluring and unsettling. Eris's gaze snapped to Lilith, her expression cold. "You'd do well to keep your ambitions in check, Lilith. Allistor doesn't take kindly to games." From her place across the table, Valara let out a lilting laugh, her crystalline eyes sparkling with amusement. She reclined in her chair, her long silver hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall. Everything about her exuded elegance and sensuality, but her smile carried a sharp edge. "Eris, darling," Valara purred, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Did you get a little too greedy? It's such a shame when our desires come back to bite us." Eris's golden eyes narrowed dangerously. "Careful, Valara. You may find yourself biting off more than you can chew. Do you really think Allistor has forgotten that you all played a role in his removal? We sealed the peacekeeper between us and the Celestials, thus leading to the Ethereal Council's collapse, and we have been at war ever since." Vilara merely chuckled, clearly unfazed by the threat. Dominus raised a hand, his commanding presence silencing the room. "Enough," he said, his voice firm but calm. He fixed Eris with an appraising look. "This development is unfortunate, but it doesn't change our position. Allistor and Lilah are in the human realm. Let them have their little war. We'll intervene only if it becomes necessary." Eris's fist clenched, but she held her tongue. She had said her piece. Now it was up to the others to decide if they would act, or if she would be left to face the fallout alone. As the conversation shifted to other matters, Eris retreated to the edge of the room, her mind racing. Allistor's freedom was a threat she couldn't ignore, and Elira's return only complicated matters further. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Aaron and Lilah's decision. Back in the mortal realm, Aaron stood by the window of his apartment, gazing out at the city. Lilah approached him cautiously, her hand resting on his arm. "We could leave," she said softly. "Start over somewhere, far away." Aaron shook his head, his expression conflicted. "It's not that simple, Lilah. Whatever's happening, it's not going to stop just because we run." Allistor's voice interjected, cold and mocking. "She's right, you know. You're in too deep, Aaron. You think this ends with Wright and Jason? This is just the beginning." Aaron clenched his fists, his gaze hardening. "I'm not giving up. Not yet." Lilah sighed, but she didn't push further. Instead, she stood beside him, her resolve strengthening. "Then we face it together.